So hello, welcome to Social Educational Project School of IT Professionals ProfIT. Today we are going to talk about education and actually about learning and active learning. And we are going to talk with amazing Barbara Oakley, professor of Auckland University. So you are free to ask your questions in comments, and we'll have a Q&A session after the Barbara speech. And also, I think we'll try a technical feature, of translation in Ukrainian. So I wouldn't steal your time anymore. The floor is yours.
Okay, so let's see what we've got here. I've got, let's see, we're here. And hopefully you are now seeing my screen. And you have disappeared. No, let's see. I think it's got the wrong screen.
Yes, it was.
Okay, hang on. Let's see. This is the screen I want. So how is that? No. Huh. I'm sorry, everyone. Just hang on a sec okay. Why is this? It is not showing. Okay, so screen, okay, I've got it. There we go. So this should be the right screen now. So it's the, so are you seeing the actual slide with the subtitles, Dmitry?
Yes.
Okay, so we're in good shape here. So I'm so pleased to be here with you today, and we're going to talk about most effective ways to learn. So I'm going to teach you as much as I possibly can in the next 50 minutes or so. So let's get started. So the brain is a really complicated place, but the fortunate thing is that we can simplify how it works to understand its basic building block, and that is the neuron. There's about 86 billion neurons in the brain. And I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, this is the part of the lecture at the very beginning, which she gets really boring because it's all scientific stuff. But let's spice it up a little bit. So we're going to use a metaphor for a neuron to help you better understand this principle, this key building block of the brain. And our metaphor is that of a space alien. And a space alien, well, you can see it's got 3 legs. On a real neuron, those are called dendrites. It has little toes on its legs, and those are called dendritic spines. And then it has an arm that reaches upwards, and that's called an axon. And what neurons actually do is they just simply reach out with their arms and tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. That's pretty much what they do. In reality, what this means is that they are sending signals on to the next neuron. It goes through their hand, through the finger, onto the toe, and to the next neuron. It is more complicated than that. So for those of you with expertise in biology, you know it's that the electrical signal goes along the axon. It then releases neurotransmitters that go on to the next neuron and send a signal, electric signal that continues. So it's more complicated, but we're not going to go there. We're just going to think of it in terms of when you learn something new, what you're really doing is creating a set of connections between neurons. And this is in long-term memory in the neocortex. So when you learn something new, you are actually, when you practice with what you've learned, you are actually building and strengthening those neural connections. So those neural connections, whenever you learn something, or sort of like they turn out to be like sets of links in a chain. So the more you practice with those sets of links, the stronger, richer, and deeper those sets of links become. So, in fact, this is one of the reasons why when you're learning something, it can be valuable to use a metaphor. So typically, professors might introduce the idea of the flow of electricity by saying that it is something like the flow of water. You know the flow of water very well. So you can just use that idea of the flow of water to much more easily build the new concept involving the flow of electrical current. So you might say, well, yes, but at a quantum level, it all breaks down. You can't use that metaphor. Well, that's true. Whenever a metaphor breaks down, you just throw it away and you get a new metaphor. So, when your brain is thinking about things, it works in two fundamentally different modes. You can almost think of that mathematically as being an orthogonal set of modes. The first mode is what I will refer to as focused mode. And that's hopefully what you're doing right now. You're focusing on the screen and trying to follow what I'm saying. But there's another mode, and that is the diffuse mode. So with the diffuse mode, you're not focusing at all. It's the kind of thinking you do when you're walking along, going for a walk somewhere, and you're thinking randomly about things. You may focus a little bit, but the thoughts are rising organically, or maybe as you're falling asleep at night or taking a shower during the day. All of these are ways of thinking using that diffuse mode. Actually, the focus mode is called by psychologists the task positive set of networks. The diffuse mode is the task negative sets of networks, or it is also referred to by psychologists as the default mode network. So as you are learning anything, of course, this idea of metaphor is very handy. So I'm going to use a metaphor to help you better understand the idea of the difference between focused and diffuse modes. Now, a good way to do that is simply to use the metaphor of a pinball machine. So if you're my age, which you are probably not, you might remember how a pinball machine works. All you have to do is just pull back on the plunger and a ball goes bouncing around on the rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball machine and we're going to insert it right onto the human brain. Are you ready for it? Here we go. Okay, so there we go. That is the pinball machine on the brain. And this is a metaphor for the focused mode of thinking. And you can see it's a metaphor, or you can see it's related to the focus mode because these little rubber bumpers are very close to one another. Now, in this mode of thinking, you often have patterns that have been laid because you have already learned something about whatever the material is that you are looking at. So for example, let's say that I asked you to multiply 22 times 47. So you may take out a piece of paper and multiply it, or some of you can just do it in your head. And as you're doing that multiplication, because you already know multiplication, your thoughts can move right along in the pathways that have already been laid, those little sets of neural links. But if you're learning something completely new, what happens is you're trying to lay a new pathway. But how can you do that? How do you actually learn something new? I mean, there's no pathway there at all to start with. You don't know where to put that pathway. You don't know how to access that pathway. So how do you learn something new? What often happens is, let's say that you know multiplication really well and you're trying to learn division. It could be a much more advanced example. You think of, taking derivatives versus taking integrals, but let's just keep it simple with a simple idea. So you know multiplication, you're learning derivatives, you're learning subtraction. And what often happens is, as you're first beginning to do division problems, that division problem, you can't help it. You start slipping back to the part of your brain that deals with multiplication, because you know multiplication really well. So you start to get frustrated because you're not able to solve the problem correctly. And you get more and more frustrated. And finally, you just close the book and you walk away because you can't seem to solve the problem. But when you walk away, as soon as you walk away, you open this very different network of thinking. Actually, this is as soon as you get your focus off of that material. So your mind still isn't thinking about it, but it's brand new. I mean, your mind is completely off of what you had been focusing on that made you frustrated. When you get your mind off of it, you can go into the default mode network, that diffuse mode. And in this mode, your thoughts can range much more widely before and what this does is it allows you, when you return to the focus mode, you've actually got a new perspective and a new way of looking at that problem that can allow you to solve that problem. So learning involves going back and forth between focus mode and diffuse mode, or default mode network. And it's important to realize that if you can't figure something out the first time you look at it, that's okay. That's perfectly normal. Some people need to go back and forth quite a few times before they actually really understand the material well. Now, you may say, yes, but my best friend, he can just sit down and really and look at it and understand it all right away. But as you will be learning through this, it's actually someone who goes very rapidly through the material, they can skip things. They can miss important points. And sometimes that much slower analysis and way of learning can actually help you learn more deeply and help your students learn more deeply. So I'm going to talk about a number of different things that relate to learning and learning well. So learning is almost like baking a cake. It has lots of different ingredients in it. One of those ingredients is procrastination. So when it comes to learning, it is incredibly important to actually sit down and start to learn. But that can be one of the hardest things for students and even for us to do. And the reason it can be so hard is that when you even just think about something you don't like or don't want to do, it activates a portion of the brain that experiences pain. And so as a consequence, this is what your brain does. You think about something you don't like or don't want to do, you turn your attention to something more pleasant because that doesn't cause the pain in the brain. And the result is that you feel happier almost instantly. So procrastination is probably the most difficult factor for people to overcome when it comes to learning. And so I'm going to show you a quick trick that you may or may not know of. If you know it already, it's good to have a little review. If you don't know it, this is like magic gold. So I've heard from literally tens of thousands of people around the world about how much this technique has helped them get through their studies, be successful in what they're studying, finish their dissertation or a project or whatever they're working on. It's a magnificent tool. So this tool is the Pomodoro Technique. It was invented by Francesco Cirillo in the 1980s. And this technique is very simple. First, all you do is you turn off all distractions, set a timer for 25 minutes, and then work as intently as you can on whatever you're studying or learning or doing, if you're grading tests or something like that. So as you're working, you're going to have thoughts that arise like, oh, I should be doing this. If so, jot that thought down. But whatever you do not stop what you're working on. So you don't answer phones. You turn off your phone if needed, or unless it's a total emergency. But just keep your focus on your work as intently as you can for those 25 minutes. And then the most important part of the Pomodoro is to simply rest your brain for 5 minutes or so. So it's, people are tempted to say that during those 5 minutes of rest, they should go check their text messages or maybe take a look at their emails. But as soon as you do that, you focus on emails, say, oh, you got an email. Oh, you start going in and working on your emails. You return immediately to your focus. The mistake is that this focus and rest actually makes clever use of the default mode network in learning. So that little bit of rest actually allows the default mode to kind of pop up and put information into long-term memory more easily. So that rest period is a critical part. In fact, one of the most important parts of this Pomodoro technique. A typical way of doing the Pomodoro is that people might say they might set 2 hours in a day where they're studying. They'll do 4 Pomodoros, each one with a 5-minute break. And in that way, they can work more effectively towards whatever they are trying to learn or master. It's much more important to set up a good process for learning than a good product for learning. In other words, don't focus on finishing whatever you're like a homework set or grading a set of materials or something. It's much more important to just say, I've got to do 25 minutes of this, and then I get to rest. This focus on just the process helps make it so it's less painful for you and you're actually more effective. So now we're going to move to a slightly different idea, and that is, what is the most effective technique to help you or your students learn more effectively? I'm going to give you 4 options. So we can reread. So, I mean, that's practice. It's going over the material again. Highlighting or underlining, you're moving your hands, so you're getting some physical activity. Perhaps that's helpful. Retrieval practice or recall. So that is simply looking at flashcards, for example, and seeing if you can retrieve that information that's on the other side of the card from your own brain, or perhaps looking at a book, looking away and seeing if you can retrieve the key idea on that page that you just read about. Or there's creating a concept map. So basically, you're creating an outline, a set of materials that can help you understand the connections between these different kinds of ideas. So dun, 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 dun. Let's see what you think. The key idea here is retrieval practice. Retrieval practice, it turns out, is far more effective than any of the other methods in helping students to really understand and learn the material more effectively. In fact, some studies have shown that if students study using retrieval practice, they can actually not only remember the material better 2 weeks later, but they can actually understand the material better and at a deeper level. So why is this? It's because when you initially learn something, like when I'm actually speaking with you right now, you're getting sets of links in your long-term memory, but they're not really very strong. And each time you ask yourself, now, what was the most important thing you said? She said, each time you ask yourself, you retrieve, you retrieve, you retrieve, and it strengthens those sets of links each time. So the best way you can learn when you're walking away from this particular seminar is to ask yourself, what were the key ideas I have learned from this? Maybe how will I apply them in whatever I'm studying or teaching? Now, another concept I think that's important to understand is simply this idea that you can learn something, you can create those sets of links, but if you do not practice with those sets of links, what's going to happen is your little neural janitors, so to speak, will come by and sweep those sets of links away because you haven't been using them. So this is why spaced repetition over a number of days is important to help build those neural links. If a student understands what you say in class, but then doesn't even look at the material for 2 weeks, what they may have understood will actually vanish, those sets of links. So they have to start afresh when they're trying to cram for a final examination. So when you are learning something, it's important to space out your learning and part over a number of days. And part of the reason for that is that when you learn something, you get these sets of links starting to go. And then during the night, your brain practices with those sets of links. So that helps strengthen those links. And we can actually see, this is a light microscopy image of a living neuron before learning and before sleep. And this is the exact same living neuron after learning and after sleep. So wherever you see these blue triangles, that's where these dendritic spines have arisen and they're starting to connect with other neurons. So it's not only the learning, it's the sleep that helps to build these neural connections. People can make the mistake of studying really hard right before an exam, getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep, but that's not enough to seal in these new connections, so you lose what you've just learned the day before. So this is why it's important to space out your learning over a number of days. If you have 5 hours, say, to study, space it out over 1 hour over 5 days, rather than, for example, just cramming everything in with 1 day of 5 hours of study, because those sets of links are much weaker. If you space things out, you're not only getting the practice that day, but you're also getting that extra practice during sleep. So it sort of doubles your effort. If you, I am the queen of metaphors. I love metaphors. So I have to give you another metaphor. And that is simply the idea that if you are building a foundation for learning, you need to have time where you lay a layer of bricks, mortar bricks, but before you go too high, you let that mortar dry. If you don't do that, you'll have a lousy foundation for learning if you try to do it all at once. It takes time. Another analogy for learning involves just weightlifting. This is known irreverently as the meathead theory of learning. And it just turns out that muscles and muscle tissue and neural tissue, they're both excitable tissues. And it takes a long time to teach these tissues, so to speak, how to do what you're training them to do. This athlete would never sit down the night before a gigantic meet and say, I'm going to cram and I'm going to build my muscular structure. It doesn't work that way. Similarly for the brain, it doesn't work to just cram it all in the night before. You're building a neural structure, and that takes time to do. So I'm going to turn to another facet of learning, and I have a question for you. And that relates to the idea of simply driving home. Let's say you're driving home one day. And I mean, I don't care whether it's um, a small country road, a major highway in a city, or maybe you're riding your bicycle home, or you're even walking home, whatever you're doing, you've done it lots of times before. So in our example, let's say you're driving home and you suddenly remember that your best friend's birthday is tomorrow and you have forgotten to get anything. So you're thinking madly, what can you get your friend? This is really important. What do I do? And then suddenly you look up and you've arrived at home. And you can't even remember actually the process of getting home because you've been thinking about your friend. Does this, here's my question, does this involve learning? So we're gonna get to that, but just kind of ask yourself, what is going on here? So what I want to just very briefly allude to is that the brain has two major ways of getting links into long-term memory. So the first way of getting links into long-term memory is through what's called the declarative system. That goes through from working memory to through the hippocampus to create sets of links in long-term memory. So there's a very famous patient known as Henry Mollison, or HM, and this patient had both of his hippocampuses or hippocampi removed. And it turned out that if you met Henry, introduced yourself, walked out of the room, and then came back in again, he would not remember that he met you, because the removal of the hippocampus meant that he could not learn new things, except for one thing. If you walked into the room and introduced yourself to Henry and reached out, shook his hand, but you had a pin in your hand, so it would prick him when you shook his hand, and then you walked out of the room again, you would walk back into the room, Henry would not know who you are, but if you reached your hand out to shake hands with Henry, he would not shake your hand, because he had learned something and he could remember it. And what he had learned was that this person actually has a very painful handshake. So he learned that through this other system called the procedural system. And the procedural system of learning is quite a different system. It's through the basal ganglia, and you're often completely unaware of what, in fact, you're always unaware of what you've learned through the procedural system. You don't know how it learns what it learns. It's completely, you're unaware of it. All you know is you learned something. Just as Henry learned, whoever that person is, don't shake hands with them. So I'll give you just a little insight about these two very important neural ways of learning. So the first system is called declarative. We've already talked. The second one is procedural. Of course, they're both depositing sets of links in long-term memory. Declarative learning, you're mostly conscious of. So you are conscious of what I am telling you here, and you're conscious of your efforts to even remember what I was saying. Procedural learning, you're not conscious of it. So had that person learned anything when they drove home through their same usual way of getting home, and they were thinking of the birthday party of their friend? Yes, they had learned something. They had driven home so many times that they had learned how to drive home through their procedural system. So they're not conscious that they've learned it, but they know it really well. Declarative learning develops through explicit instruction. So it's, I'm explaining to you exactly what you're learning. Procedural learning often develops through practice, and it particularly develops through spaced repetition, as we discussed, and also through interleaving, that is, mixing together closely related concepts so that you begin to pick up the pattern of the differences and the similarities between those two or those related concepts. For example, if I am teaching you about problem solving and you are expected to solve a problem using binomial theorem or negative binomial theorem or geometric distribution, then each one of these is different, but they're all rather closely related. So your tendency is to do a bunch of binomial problems, do a bunch of negative binomial problems, and do a bunch of geometric problems. And then you think you know each one really well. But on a final examination, those three types of problems would be mixed up. So unless you interleaved those different problem-solving techniques in your original practice that you're doing to learn these techniques, you can very easily mix up how to solve those problems or what the appropriate technique for solving that problem actually is. So this is why it's so important to interleave, mix up whatever you're learning. Of course, that's in math. You want to mix up different things. Textbooks are not set up this way. They will give you a chunk of problems about a certain idea, but they won't mix up those problems. So that's why it's important for professors and for students themselves to find ways to mix up problems so they're interleaving, and then that will help build their procedural understanding of the pattern differences between these problems. Likewise, when you're studying a language, if you're studying Spanish or English, what is future tense? What is past tense? What is present tense? Mix them up. Do not just do a whole bunch of past tense things. And then when you have a sentence where you have to mix together all three different tenses, you can't do it because you're not used to mixing them together. So this interleaving idea is a very, very important one. Sorry about that. Let's hope this, well, there we go. In this kind of learning, you can explain declarative learning. So what you've learned declaratively, step by step, you can explain it. But what you've learned procedurally is often much more difficult to explain. You can understand and be able to do something really well. You may not be able to explain it. That's because you've learned it procedurally. It's really hard to explain how to solve a Rubik's Cube. It is really hard to explain how to tie your shoelaces. It can be very hard if you are a native speaker of a language. You learn your language procedurally. So you may not even understand why you do the things you do in your native language. You just do them. So it can be hard to explain why you're doing things. Hang on a sec. So declarative learning often involves sequential tasks where procedural is more complicated sorts of things. You're picking up these patterns. And declarative learning is very fast to learn. Like you can sit and memorize a vocabulary list. You've got it through the declarative system, but if you haven't practiced with that vocabulary list, you have not developed your procedural links. Your declarative and your procedural links are quite different. You need to be able to stand on both. You need to be able to use both. And it is only practice with the words in that vocabulary list that also helps you to be swift to use those words. So it takes a long time to do procedural learning, but once you've done it, you can know it and be able to do it very, very well. For example, you can see even in mathematics, you look at this, if you know your math, you know that simply simplifies to K. But if you haven't learned your math procedurally, these kinds of relationships, it actually can be very, very difficult for students to be able to do even simple tasks. Declarative learning, very flexible, whereas procedural learning, very inflexible. So I can type very rapidly because I've learned it procedurally, but I can't, if you went in and messed around with my keyboard, so you mixed up some of the letters on my keyboard, then it would be very difficult for my fingers to learn how to change to the new arrangement on the keyboard because I've learned it procedurally, which is very inflexible. So declarative learning happens because I explain things to you, but when you actively practice with things, that's when you also learn procedurally. And with that active practice, you want to use spaced repetition, use interleaving, and retrieval practice. All of those will help build those procedural sets of links that in tandem with declarative can really help you be a good, very good expert with whatever you are learning. So it's almost like for your long-term memory, you can use declarative or procedural. Some people prefer more using declarative. There's some indication that those with dyslexia may learn better declaratively. Some people learn a little better procedurally. So there's some indication that perhaps those with autism spectrum disorder may learn better procedurally. But where it's possible, we want to balance our instruction so that students are learning through both modalities. And a good way to do that is to give them a little bit of fun reward. Even just posing a question that's kind of interesting, like, is driving home in traffic a form of learning? When you learn what the solution to that is, that you're not aware of it, but you get this little release of dopamine that actually helps enhance your learning through both the declarative and procedural pathways. But this also brings us to a very, very important point, and that is when you eliminate rote learning. So Western approaches often say, oh, drill and kill, it's so bad for you. No, it's not. Actually, if you eliminate any form of rote learning, it actually eliminates one of the easiest ways the brain has to integrate these insights and use them in an easy way so you can think about the harder things while you do the other things just routinely without even having to think about them. So I like to think of it and not as drill and kill, but rather as drill to skill, because it's a great way to help enhance learning. And when you're drilling, interleaving, spaced repetition, retrieval practice, all of those play an important role. So that's simply, just remember this. And here's a way that you can visualize what's going on between spaced repetition, interleaving. One, if you block your study, you're teaching, for example, how to do geometric distribution, and you are giving problems, like 10 problems in a row that give them an understanding of geometric distribution, and then 10 problems more that are binomial, 10 more that are negative binomial. You want to avoid that kind of thing. You want to mix things up. And students will think, oh, I'm not learning as well because it's harder, but they're actually learning even better. So in a nutshell, we've covered the idea of how procedural learning can greatly enhance all of your learning, and that both systems are very, very important for learning. Now, I know what you're probably thinking is well, you did not give us enough time to practice with the information that you have just shared with us. But I would like to give you some insight on my favorite athlete of all time. His name is Julius Yego. And Julius is from Kenya. Kenya is very well known for their long distance runners. If you look at Julius's arms, he does not look like a long distance runner. His arms are really quite hefty. And indeed, he always wanted to learn how to throw the javelin. There were no javelin throwing coaches in all of Kenya. He couldn't afford to go overseas and study with a good javelin throwing coach. So instead, he just began watching YouTube videos. And simply by watching YouTube videos and then going out and practicing, watching, practicing, he became the world champion in throwing the javelin. So whatever you're learning, you may think, oh, it's impossible for me to learn this online. Well, you can learn way more than you think online. And the real key is I'm giving you direct, explicit, declarative type instruction for you now. For you to really, really learn it though, you need to go off and practice. So as you walk away, retrieve what the key ideas were. Try to think of how you can use this in your learning or in your teaching, these kinds of ideas. Because the more I would integrate practice into what I am teaching about, the less time I have to actually share this information. So it would dramatically reduce the amount of information I could provide. So I will be counting on you, if possible, to please go forth and practice, review and practice the key ideas that we've learned about here today. And it's just been a real, just a treasure to share with you. And Dimitro he's really quite a guy, and I couldn't resist, and I had to say yes, I would be happy to share with you, thanks to his gracious invitations. So I'll stop sharing here, and Dimitro, it's over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot. It was very interesting. But I have some questions.
Okay.
The first question maybe will be on the last case about the sportsman. What do you think? Do we need to go in class to learn something, or you can just watch video, go practice that skill, and that's all, and it's enough?
Oh, well, the answer is always, it depends. Actually, for a surprising number of cases, watching video, it all goes back to the motivation of the learner. A highly motivated learner can learn through virtually any mechanism. As long as they can get good instruction, they can make good progress. Students who are less motivated, however, it can help them to have a structure where they must go to class and they must watch the teacher in class. It can be helpful. So I would not want to go to a brain surgeon and have brain surgery from a surgeon who only learned online. So there are certain things that I think there are definitely ways that you can do simulations that can help you learn more quickly, but some things just have to be done face to face. But I do think that although COVID has had some many negative kinds of things going on in the world, it's also been a boon because people have finally, sometimes grudgingly, had to accept the fact that actually online learning can do a lot of good for a lot of people.
Okay, and you talked a lot about intrinsic motivation and fighting procrastination. Actually, that's part I love the best from your books. And I would like to ask you about extrinsic motivation. So how important is to tell students that they're great, they're doing well, and in general, is it necessary to do that?
Yes, I think it is necessary to do that. Um, people, so first off, as you've seen from the presentation, procedural learning is a very important part of how we learn. That procedural learning system only learns if it gets feedback. So if you hit a baseball and you never got any feedback about how well that ball actually hit, whether you hit the ball, whether it went where you wanted it to go, you would never learn anything. And it's similar. Procedural learning is really important for all kinds of learning, whether you're learning to write, whether you're learning to write at advanced literary levels, doing math, whatever you're learning. If you don't get feedback, you're not going to be able to do you're not even going to be able to learn. So people often say, oh, well, but it's stressful for students to take tests. And so we don't want to lower their self-esteem by having them take tests. Well, first of all, the self-esteem literature has been roundly debunked by researchers. So this idea that raising students' self-esteem is going to simultaneously help them do better in virtually all aspects of life is really a false one. In fact, artificially boosting a student's self-esteem by telling them they're really good at something they're not good at can actually create just a whole mountain of problems. And I truly believe that there are more problems from cocky individuals who think they've got it all right and haven't learned to accept critical feedback than there are from people who have, gotten overly critical feedback. Although feedback, of course, must be done with consideration. You certainly don't want to ridicule or browbeat. But the procedural learning system learns because you know that you did something wrong. And but in any case, we learn better when we have some stress. This is called eustress. It releases just enough neurochemicals so that we think a little bit smarter and we actually pay more focused attention and we're actually more cognitively focused. And if we don't have any stress, we're actually not as sharp. In fact, one recent study showed that people, they just analyzed people who lived a variety of lifestyles. And it turns out that people who live low stress lifestyles are usually not as cognitively sharp as the ones who live more stressed lifestyles. So when, for example, you and I are about to go live and I'm sitting there going, oh, my audio's not working. Why is my audio not working? And I'm trying to get my audio working. That stress is actually helping to keep me cognitively sharp. So testing gives feedback, helps students get a little bit of stress to do their best, and that helps also to seal in that new learning.
Great, thank you. Okay, I wanted to talk about technologies and how technologies affect learning efficiency. It's like a huge topic. The first thing is you talked about some tactile sensations that it helps to learn. So, for example, now most of people don't read like paper books. So, for example, I have read one of your books like paper, and the second one is on my phone. What is better? How it influence like learning efficiency?
Um, okay, so this is a really good question that is very broad in its scope. So, um, uh, first, there is some evidence that if you are studying in school and you have a hard a textbook as opposed to an electronic text, that the hard textbook is easier to annotate and easier to learn from. By the same token, I think some of the new technologies that are coming about that allow you to write and annotate in electronic versions of textbooks are, I think, really quite marvelous, and they may make it so that they're virtually synonymous. Oh, incidentally, people sometimes wonder, can I learn as well if I'm listening to a book on audio as opposed to actually reading it? And it turns out you get pretty much the same level of comprehension either way. So, but technology is, I think, going to be the miracle worker of the future, because a lot of times what people don't realize is that, well, for one thing, let's say you're 65 years old and you feel your cognition is not the same as when you were 25. That's probably true. If you go play action style video games, the kind where you pop around the corner and somebody's shooting at you, that kind of thing has been shown to enhance your attentional and focusing abilities, to bring you back not only to the level you were at when you were in your 20s, but actually above that. So action style video games can really keep people from going into a cognitive decline. And there is work at present to get there's a race ongoing to get the first video game approved by the Federal Drug Administration in the US as a drug to help enhance cognition in older people. But so gaming is a really good way to, get your focus back. But we also know, and gamification has been a buzzword for a long time. And part of the challenge is simply it's tough to gamify. And it's as Daphne Balvalier, who's a major researcher in this area, has said, it's like trying to put broccoli and chocolate together and make something that's actually tasty. It's pretty tough to do, but it so but if we're able to get good games for learning math, for example, practicing getting that procedural fluency, learning to type, learning all of these kinds of more procedurally oriented skills, boy, video and technology is going to be awesome in removing the grading burden from teachers and enhancing students' abilities to use some of these kinds of really important procedurally based skills.
Okay, and if we are talking about video games, so you said that it helps to increase your focus, yes? And
Yes.
could you use it in real life? Because I read some articles about video games and learning, and most of them said that with video games you can learn only that specific skill which you need in that video game.
Oh, okay.
Not improve your memory or making you smarter. What do you think about it?
So what they're talking about is correct in the sense that, so we have two major forms of memory. One is long-term memory, and the other is working memory, which you can sort of think of as nearly the same thing as short-term memory. So short-term memory, or working memory a little bit, is like I give you a number to remember, and then you give it back to me. So I say 792453, and you would repeat it to yourself so that you could give me back that same number. If you stopped repeating it, you would probably forget it. So remembering that number is using short-term memory. If I asked you to multiply 79 times 12, you would have to use your working memory to manipulate what you're holding in your short-term memory. But in any sense, most people have a working memory capacity that's around four. They can hold four things in it. So if I gave you a number like, 10 digits long and you were able to remember it, it's because you broke it into groups that those groups would essentially have about four items in total. Some people have huge working memories. Some people, like me, have smaller working memories. If I have not had my coffee in the morning, it's more like I can hold maybe one thing in working memory. That's it. But anyway, the the only way to enhance working memory that we know of in general for people is to become literate. So it's almost like height. If you learn to read, you can actually get your height. It's like good nutrition. You can get your height to a certain height. So on average, four items. But you can't do anything to change it beyond being literate. But what you can do is you can learn a specific topic, and it is the equivalent of on that topic, your working memory becomes larger. It does not transfer to all skills. So it's only for that thing. But what I'm talking about with cognition in regards playing action style video games is not increasing working memory, which we don't know how to do yet, unless you zap a little bit and maybe do a little bit of an increase with electronic amplification. But we don't want to do that all the time. But what you are doing is you're increasing your ability to focus. So you're not increasing your working memory capacity. So it's this kind of thing. I get up in the morning, I walk down, I'm doing my stuff, and I get up to go walk into the kitchen, and I get in the kitchen and I go, why did I go in the kitchen? What was I looking for? I forgot it. You lost that focus. And action style video games helps with this kind of thing.
Very interesting. Okay, let's go back to technologies. The second thing about technologies I wanted to ask you is about information. Now we have like a lot of information available. How does that affect learning and actual educational systems? So I remember what I learned at school, like all the dates in history subjects and so on. Do we need now to remember all that information, or we need to concentrate on skills and that's all because information is available?
So let me put it this way. Let's say that you used Google Translator to translate my talk into Ukrainian. Do I know Ukrainian? No, I don't know it. I can always look it up though, but I still really do not know Ukrainian. I don't know the traditions. I don't know the culture. I don't know really anything. I can just look it up. It is really that way with all of our learning. Sure, you can go and look up little individual facts, but if you don't have a set of shelves within your mind to put those facts within, it's going to be even harder for you to learn any of those facts. So this idea that we can always just go look things up is a really pernicious, bad idea. Because if you don't have the good neural structure of learning, it actually can really cripple your ability to learn well. So you may think, oh, I had to learn all these dates for different events in history. Why? I can always go look it up. But if I asked you to compare the Russian Revolution with the American Revolution, if you didn't know what the dates were, you wouldn't even kind of know how to get started with those comparisons. If you have no set of framework of critical dates in Ukrainian history, let's say you have those dates, you can much more easily begin to learn about world events because you can relate them to what you already know about those critical dates in Ukrainian history. So as we've discussed, learning really involves creating sets of neural links in your own memory. And the main idea here is for key things you are learning, you want to create that set of shelves, that set of neural links that you can use to learn, hang your new learning in on. We know that if you do not learn how to read, your working memory, your whole intelligence deteriorates because you have not learned to read. What we learn interacts with our intelligence and our ability to learn new things in a very complex way. So if you, in fact, around the world, those techniques, those um, educators who begin to use theories of you don't need to look it up. You can always just, I mean, you can always just look it up. You don't need to remember anything, no rote learning. In those countries, IQs have begun a marked decline over the last 40 years, ever since the cognitive revolution. So part of this may well be that simply the brain learns in two major ways. It learns through declarative learning, and it also, all the stuff you do all the time, you want to learn through the procedural system. When we threw that system out, we crippled students' abilities to really learn effectively, and that cripples IQ scores as well.
Very good point. Uh, okay, thank you. And last maybe thing about technologies is distractions. Nowadays we have all that notifications like social medias and so on. I actually very like the technique Pomodoro. But if we are talking in general about the learning process nowadays, how that influence and how what should we do with that?
So in the mid 1800s, the very famous French novelist Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables and many other famous novels, would, at least according to legend, ask his servant to lock him naked in his study with only a pen and paper to force him to concentrate on what he was working on, because there were just so many things he could distract himself with. This was in the mid 1800s. We have always had sort of, I mean, at least in the last, hundreds and hundreds of years, we've had ways of being distracted from whatever we're learning. And of course, some technology companies make it a sort of a mission to find ways to distract us. But all we need to do is set up techniques such as using the Pomodoro technique that make us, that help protect us against some of these distracting sorts of ideas, or sorts of things like Facebook and so forth. So, it's simply a way of setting up a system that allows you to really focus on the things you think are important to be focusing on, and to become somewhat less distractible. So I think a little distraction actually is healthy and is good. And in fact, there's proof that some distraction helps with, and multitasking, they always say, is very bad, and it is when you're trying to concentrate on things. But actually, a little multitasking here and there, sort of being distracted by this or that, can help with creativity. So I think it's actually not as hard as one might think to just sort of say, what are the key things? Yeah, sure, there's an overwhelming welter, and if I concentrate on all the millions of things out there, I will feel overwhelmed. But if you just say, what can I reasonably do? What do I want to keep my focus on for this time period today? You can you can live a happy, meaningful, worthwhile life, even as you're doing some very productive activities.
Okay, thank you. And you also talked about several techniques and methods of learning, maybe learning styles. So, do we need to choose one, or we should combine it to be more effective?
I think it's always a good idea as much as you can to combine. So if you're talking about declarative and procedural, so understanding as you are being explained something, but then practice a lot with it to help build your procedural understanding. In tandem, those are really both important. But in sometimes you can't begin practicing until you've got the declarative explanation to get you started. So both are important, but the practice takes much longer.
Okay, and what do you think about predisposition to something? For example, it's believed that some people have like great abilities in technical sciences, some in humanities. Is it true?
Yes, there's great evidence that, for example, if you have a higher working memory capacity and good spatial abilities, it is easier for you to learn mathematics. But this does not mean that if your working memory capacity is lower, such as mine, or your spatial abilities are average or below average, you can actually build your spatial abilities through practice. Now, you can't increase your working memory capacity, but you can definitely enhance your working or your spatial abilities. As we've seen, for example, in taxi drivers in London who learn all the streets, they go and look at their hippocampuses and they actually have grown larger because they have gained this spatial ability. But if you are, what's really important is that we have people who are in each discipline who have different ways of learning that discipline. For example, let's say you are like, I'm really good at verbal sorts of things. So it took me more time to learn, and it takes me more time to learn something mathematical. But when I learn it really deeply because it does not come naturally to me. So when I was studying circuits, advanced circuits, and so forth, who comes to me? The ones who are really smart and learn it really quickly because they still don't understand it as deeply as I do. So I'm not saying I'm brilliant because it takes me a long time. But for example, Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, said, I was really a crummy learner. I'm really slow. It's hard for me to learn things. All my colleagues are the ones who can like learn super fast, remember all this stuff. And here I am struggling along. Yet he's the one who won the Nobel Prize. And he said the reason for this is simply that I had to really struggle with my learning. I couldn't remember things. I'd have to go over and over. But through this process, he would find little cracks in the theories and the ideas and the assertions of economics that were wrong. All these smart people couldn't see it. But because Hayek was, slower and not as smart, he could actually see the things that all the geniuses were missing. So I think it's a very bad idea to tell people to just follow their passion and go at what they're good at, because that's easy. And a lot of people are really good at the easy things. So if you go into these easier subjects that everybody really likes, you're going to end up finding yourself with a very low paying job on average, and a job that you may not find very challenging in the long run. It was all easy for you. If, on the other hand, you are studying, if you see, I specialized in one thing early on. I learned a language. I learned it as well as I possibly could, and I learned nothing else. And then when I was trying to go out of the military, and I found that nobody wanted to hire me because all I knew was how to speak a language, which is now very rusty. Извините, я забыла все, что знала. Anyway, so what I found was that following my passion, doing what I liked and what was easy for me, actually ended up putting me in a career box that made real problems for me. So I always say, don't just follow your passion, broaden your passion, learn new things, expand what you think you can do. And you can find that you can do surprisingly better even than those who are naturally gifted at what you're learning.
Very interesting. And the point is that actually not in that you have only one skill, but that the skill you've got, you have the skill because it was hard for you. Yes, then
Yes.
you're learning better.
Yes. And you can always learn what comes easy and what you love, but broaden what you love. So learn also other skills because it can be too easy in this changing world to suddenly find yourself in a career box and no one wants to hire you.
Great. Okay. What else I have? So I wanted also to talk a bit about educational systems and about pandemic. In Ukraine, we have with that pandemics and lockdowns, we have all Ukrainian online school. It was launched like March last year. And some top teachers recorded their lessons and they broadcast them on YouTube, on TV channels. So children look at that lessons, like that video lessons, and after that, their real teachers checked the tasks, what they done. What do you think about that way and how perspective it in the global world? Because it seems that uh, that top teachers could tell information and can make their lessons much better than the average one.
I think Ukraine is being in the advanced part of the world with this approach. Some countries just simply have shut down education and tried to minimize people's ability to get even access to good online learning. So I think I really salute Ukraine and I salute the idea of getting your best teachers and teaching in that way, and then local teachers facilitating. The great thing of doing things this way too is you have economies of scale. So if you have some, instead of having everybody create their own videos for their own classes, it's it's really hard. I mean, teaching online is different than teaching face to face. And if you, it always makes me laugh because teachers are like, you never really know something unless you can transfer your learning to something new. And then when they are given the task of transferring their teaching to a different modality, they're lost, but that's part of what they needed to do was transfer their teaching. And it's harder to do. And it's a new modality. But actually, you can create even more effective lessons if you are really careful in how you teach them, because you can have these animations that grab people's attention, the motion, the kinds of tricks that are used in good video games. So, for example, the MOOC that I'm creating now, you can see I'll be sitting here just like I'm sitting here, and then my head will come up off, and then something will squish down into my head, and then my head will come back. And it's really unexpected, but you can do this kind of thing. And it keeps people's interest even more than if you're just standing in a classroom. So I think that that is actually a great way of doing things. And especially having teachers check work, because some students are really going to still need that local motivation. So it seems to me that you've kind of handled the best of online with local face-to-face in a really good way.
Okay, and if we think about future, what will be in future? It will be online, offline, or some blended uh, models.
I think it's pretty clear that we'll have some more blending going on. Um, it depends on the country and the vision of the country. Some country, there's the old joke that moving a university is like moving a cemetery. You cannot expect any help from the inhabitants. So, for example, school districts, school systems, universities, they have their way of doing things. They've always done it that way, and they do not want to change. So they will do everything they can to resist things like moving to a more blended format or a more online format. It does make me laugh in that some of the leading individuals I've seen who are highly critical of online learning, from, for example, a top university in the top 3 universities worldwide, will get on. They'll give a Zoom lecture about how online learning is just never going to be as good. It's as face to face. And as they're talking, they have a picture of their book behind them, right beside them. So they talk for half an hour and their only visual is a book. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is how you not do online instruction. You don't just sit there and talk with no visuals and you're just advertising yourself. I mean, online, it's no wonder that person thinks online learning is bad, because if they teach their classes the way they just taught us about how bad online learning is, it's no wonder they think online learning is bad. So you just have to be very, very careful when you hear critics of online learning, because they're often criticizing online learning because they don't know how to do it themselves, and they have vested interests with colleagues who they want to support, who also think that online learning is not good because they make their living from face to face. So that's a bit of the curmudgeon in me.
Okay, and if we are talking not only about tools, but about system in general, like school and university systems, nearly the same like for last 100 years. And now we see like that people need some short courses, some micro credits, something like that. They changes their careers through the life. Should the system change?
Well, universities are going to do everything they can to resist change and to ensure that the traditional approach to degrees with a bachelor's degree, master's, and doctorate are the way that people go. So I suspect for a long time in the future, we will still have that basic structure of bachelor's, master's, doctorate, but that increasingly, just as we see now, smaller degrees, certificates, micro credentials, and so forth are going to become more important. What I do think is going to be the wave of the future is, so if you look recently, a fellow named Zvi Galil, his name is Galil. He is or was the former dean of Georgia Tech University. And he started an innovative program where you could get your master's in computer science from Georgia Tech, one of the top universities, for $6,600 for the complete degree. And when you get your diploma, it just says Georgia Tech. It doesn't say Georgia Tech Online. They find the graduates of this program are fully equivalent to those who are face-to-face paying $40,000. So this extraordinarily low-cost program is now capturing some 10% of the US market for computer science master's degrees. is phenomenal. And most universities just aren't thinking like Zvi is thinking. Universities are thinking, how can I make money from my university? How can I, have all us professors making lots of money? How can, what Zvi was thinking was, how can we help students the most by making something super low cost they can actually afford? And I think that that is the wave of the future. And there's all sorts of, because of what Zvi has done, I know of lots of things that are bubbling in the background. There's going to be competition for the online platforms that are currently out there. There's going to be some really, really interesting, low cost, fantastic programs for students that are really high quality.
Okay, great thing to finish our almost 1.5 hour talk. I was appreciate talk with you today. Thanks a lot for being here.
My pleasure. And I just hope everyone had a good time and learned a lot.
Yes, wish you big health and hope to meet you offline.
I hope so too. And remember, retrieve the key points today.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Bye.